The year was 2004, in an office tower in Midtown Los Angeles, and I was getting chills. I was sitting in an edit bay, editing a scene that spoke of an amazing transformation that had taken place and the promise that it was just about to happen again for someone else. Not only did I feel a very powerful sense of gratitude and hope while I was cutting it, I knew that it would very soon be seen by millions of people, and it could help bring about change in their lives too. These kinds of moments have happened over and over for me in my career, and I'm here to help those moments happen for you in your creating. For that to happen, we got to back up and talk about our brains. According to science, the only way our brains can make sense of the world is to take the insane amount of information flooding it at any given second and ignore virtually all of it. This is how our brains work. Ignoring almost anything is literally the only way we can survive without going insane. So if, as content creators, we want to spread our message and connect with our audience, how do we get past the gatekeepers of audience brains whose primary job is to keep almost everything from getting in the first place? Is it easy? No. Can it be done? Absolutely. Can you do it? Yes, you can. And when you do, you have the chance to not only connect with people in your audience, you literally have the chance to help them change their lives too. Let's talk about that. Welcome to the Story Greenlight podcast, where we're all about empowering creators like you to tell your stories, connect with your audience, and create the impact that you were put on this planet to make. My name is Jeff Bartsch. I'm a coach, author, and entrepreneur with over 20 years of experience shaping content for ABC, NBC, Universal, Disney, Apple, and a whole bunch of others. My team and I support creators with followings in the hundreds to the many millions. At Story Greenlight, we believe that you matter, your message matters, and the world needs to hear what you have to say. If you are a content creator looking to spread your message, you already know that you're fighting an uphill battle to connect with your audience in the first place. Never mind be remembered by them and build an active relationship with you. Now, is it possible? Yes, it is. Is it easy? Not really. Specifically, for creators on YouTube, we have multiple issues going on. Issue number one, there is a mountain of content out there and most of it never gets seen. And as creators, we can't control that directly, at least. How do you get your stuff in front of your audience if it's not something that you can control? Issue number two, once you do get your stuff in front of people who are the right fit for you and they click on your content, how do you get them to care about your stuff and keep coming back and maybe even remember you and your content for years to come? Now, disclaimer, in order to get into this, we got to jump into a bit of YouTube theory. Now, I am not a how to grow on YouTube guy. There are plenty of amazing established experts, many of whom you can hear already on this podcast and in the future episodes of this podcast. So for now, though, got to explain some things to set up the bigger picture. So issue number one, there's a mountain of content. Most of it never gets seen, and we as creators can't directly control that. So we have a goal. Our goal is to get the algorithm to push our stuff out into the world. And we want YouTube's machinery to pluck us out of obscurity and place our content in front of the right people for us. We want to have it rank in search terms and have it suggested to people who are most likely to watch it. Now, this is the algorithm's job. It is to connect the right content with the right people who will watch lots of content on YouTube so that YouTube can show lots of ads and make lots of money. This is the job of the algorithm, and the algorithm wants to help us. Now, if you're just starting out, it's a bit of a chicken and egg kind of a thing. I mean, how do you if you don't have a lot of subscribers and the algorithm won't spread your stuff, then people don't see it, then how am I supposed to get more subscribers? And I'm done before I even start. Woe is me. Why am I even doing this? I quit. Remember, the algorithm wants to help us, but we have to play by its rules. So here's how we do it. If you want the algorithm to spread your stuff, you have to create content for a specific audience who will love what you make. You make stuff that connects with them and what they want. This is why it becomes a bit of a challenge when, as creators, we come to the table and say, oh, well, I feel like I should create this and I'm creating for me. Well, there is some validity to that at times. And if you really want to work with the platform and have it work on your behalf, you have to work with what the algorithm wants, which is they want people to want to watch your stuff, not just what you want to create. So you have to have an audience who wants what you're putting out there. When your existing audience shows that they love your stuff by watching it and staying on YouTube the way YouTube wants, then the algorithm goes out and finds more people likely to watch your stuff and suggests your videos to them. Which takes us to the next question. When YouTube suggests your videos to new people who don't know you, does your content get their attention? So the goal at this point is to persuade people to click on your videos. This is where you have to put on your sales hat. Like it or not, we are all in the business of selling our content to potential audience members to say, hey, you should watch this. You are pitching, you are selling your content with two main things, your title and your thumbnail. Titles and thumbnails are mission critical to convincing an existing audience member or a potential audience member to click on your stuff and watch it. Now, I'm not going to talk about them here because there are literally thousands of videos on YouTube from highly established experts talking about this very thing. So, not going to talk about that here. Just going to say it's the algorithm's job to put the content in front of people who are likely to watch and like your stuff, but it's our job as creators to convince them to click. Now, to restate issue number one, there is a mountain of content and most of it never gets seen in the first place, and we as creators can't directly control that. So we have to work with the YouTube algorithm to create for a specific audience who will connect with our content. The algorithm then works to put the right content in front of the right people. Then it's our job to write a title for the video and to craft a thumbnail that generates the desire for the right people to click on our content. Once we got that in, we're faced with issue number two. Once you get your stuff in front of people who click on your content, how do you get them to care about your stuff and keep coming back? And maybe even for them to remember you or your content for years to come. Now, this is where a lot of people will just say, oh, that's really hard to answer. Just be yourself and talk about what you know, just do you and just do it. And sometimes that's what people need to hear. And more often that idea of just be yourself, hit the record button and hit the upload button is not helpful at all. Which brings us back to the idea of our brains and the brains of our audience and our brain's very specific desire to ignore almost everything. These days, it's super popular to talk about shrinking attention spans and how kids are spending hours and hours in front of screens. Our world is going to hell in a handbasket, the sky's falling, all the things. Well, turns out that's only part of the picture. All along, our brains have not been paying attention to pretty much anything the whole time anyway. According to science, our senses bombard our brains with up to 11 million bits of information every single second. Now, out of those 11 million pieces of information every second, guess how many bits our conscious brain is able to process in any given second? Some scientists say 50, and others are generous and say 120. So 11 million comes in, gets shrunk down to, let's be generous and just say 120. Run the numbers, and that is 0.001% that gets through to our brain in any given second. Now, if for some reason our brains get out of balance with that, we end up with autism or some kind of sensory processing disorder, and it gets really messy really quickly. But either way, you get this idea of the brain grabbing certain pieces of stimuli out of this massive river of information, blasting at it every second that we're conscious. And it reminded me of something that I read within the last years here. Now, I'm a huge reader, though mostly nonfiction books via audiobooks because I'm an oral learner. That's just the way it works with my brain. And somewhere I remembered reading in one of these books about how the brain stores memories not as streams. We tend to think of memories stored as streams, just because that's how we live our life. But they're actually stored more as snapshots. Now, not actual pictures, but collections of stimuli and impulses, kind of like keyframes in an animation, which I'll be talking more about in a second. So in this book that I'm pretty sure says this, but I can't remember which book it actually is, the brain recalls these individual keyframe memories and recreates the full stream of memory. Or what we think is a full stream, it actually turns out our brains are notorious for getting memories wrong on recall because it didn't record the whole stream. It's just making up the stuff between the individual keyframe moments, which is kind of a big deal if you're sitting in a courtroom testifying or something like that. So if you happen to know which book I'm talking about, please let me know, because not knowing the specific source of this is kind of driving me nuts. There is a link in the show notes to a voicemail. If you have any questions about this, or if you want to let me know which book I'm talking about, or if I'm completely off base, please let me know. There's a link in the show notes for a voicemail where you can do exactly that. But just with the sheer fact of monstrous amount of information being squeezed down to tiny bits of information that's actually comprehended by our conscious brain, there's got to be some way that the brain latches on to the important parts. That's the main point of what I was remembering here. And I thought, maybe this is something we could latch on to, especially with the idea of keyframes, because the idea of keyframes has been around ever since moving pictures were invented. Now, if you're not familiar with how traditional animation was produced, it started out super simple. I mean, maybe you got one of those little flip books when you're a kid, and I remember having these tiny little books where you could just flip the pages, and there was a drawing in the upper right-hand corner of each page, and when you flip through the pages of the book, you can just see these images were actually frames of an animation, and this character comes to life as you're flipping through the book. And that's how motion pictures work at all. Lots of still images projected really quickly one after the other. Now, in terms of animation, it used to be that one person would draw all those pictures, and it would be a lot of work and lots of pictures, usually hundreds of them. And as animation got more complex in the 1920s with companies like Disney turning these, what started out as maybe 4 or 5 or 7 minute short animations into feature films, the whole system was developed to crank out not just hundreds of pictures, but thousands of hand-drawn pictures to create feature film animations. So in order to do that, you had to divide and conquer. A lead animator would be the one to design a character and design the expressions and the movements, and then to apply those ideas to the specific story that the animation was showing. And they would draw keyframes, key moments of motion or character change, and that would be drawn by the lead animator. And then assistant animators would take over, and they would fill in the in-between frames. They came to call it tweening. That's what the process was called. Drawing in all those extra pictures in between the keyframes. So I was thinking about that animation process with keyframes and tweening, and thinking about how it applies to the idea of our brains squeezing massive amounts of information down to selected inputs and memories. And I realized that it was probably less like animation keyframes and more like modern video compression, which is all about taking huge amounts of data and squeezing them down to a smaller size, preferably without losing too much image quality in the process. Now, because I know you're dying to know all the technical details of how video compression works, I will spare you all the grisly details, but I promise this does actually have some bearing on how you and I can create moments that stick in our audience's hearts and minds. So video compression is all about taking large amounts of data and squeezing it down into smaller amounts of data. And you can start, maybe the process is just all about you shoot great big frame sizes, high resolution frame sizes in your camera. Say you're shooting with a cinema camera and they might shoot in 4K resolution or something larger than that. And then new versions of those files are created that are at 2K resolution, which is much smaller. And sometimes a lot smaller than that, depending on what you're using for your editing process. But if you're looking to compress video files, it's not enough just to say, oh, we're gonna make the frame size smaller. You need a system that squishes the files down and then reconstitutes the full video stream on playback. It compresses and then it decompresses. So people take those two words and they call it a codec for short. Compress, decompress, codec. It's a system that does that. So as of this recording, a codec called H.264 is one of the most widely used codecs for video compression. It's not the most recent, but it is still very popular. And here's how a codec like H.264 works. It starts with your source stream of however many frames per second. Let's just say we're running at 24 frames per second. And so the goal is to take all the image quality of the frames without taking up the space to record every part of every single frame. So you have three kinds of frames in this compression scheme. You have an intra frame, you have the I frame, you have the P frame, you have the predictor frame, and then you have the B frame. It predicts bidirectionally. And so the I frame, that's like your keyframe. It is processed independently like a still image. It has all the information in that frame right there. The P frames, they come later and they predict the change that happens from the last iframe. Then there are B frames that happen after the P frames, and it predicts back and forth bidirectionally between the last P frame and the next iframe. Point being, iframes take up the most space because they're full images, where the other frames are smaller because they consist of just what's changed and they leave out the other stuff that hasn't changed. So if you're a computer engineer and you want to create a super small video file, then you fiddle with moving iframes farther apart. Now, that does make the video size smaller, but there's also a problem with that. The farther away the iframes are, the more those other frames in the middle have to guess at what the change happens, and the more the compression algorithm has to guess about the right way to predict all those changes with fewer reference points. And that means it's more likely to get things wrong, which shows up as weird compressions and glitches and artifacts and all the things that don't make compressed video look all that great. So either way, you end up taking a stream of video and squishing it down to a more manageable size, much like our brains do, with all the information getting filtered down to something our brains can actually handle. I sat thinking about this, and it seemed to make sense that as creators, we should be working to create those moments that stand out from the rest, like the keyframes in traditional animation, like the iframes in video compression. And I started digging into some research about how the brain actually works. And it turns out I was right. Came across a study from Columbia University with the title, "When Storing Memories, Brain Prioritizes Those Experiences That Are Most Rewarding." So here's a quote from Daphna Shohami. She is the senior study author and principal investigator at Columbia's Mortimer B. Zuckerman Mind-Brain Behavior Institute. She's also a professor in the Department of Psychology. She says, "Our memory is not an accurate snapshot of our experiences. We can't remember everything. One way the brain solves this problem is by automatically filtering our experiences, preserving memories of important information, and allowing the rest to fade away." Our brain plays favorites. It filters out the important stuff and gets rid of the rest of it. But how does it decide what is important and what to grab on from that fire hose of information and pay attention to, and maybe even encode as a memory? So I started digging into how brain stores memory, and I immediately got bogged down. Because as with many things, especially when you're talking about how the brain works, this stuff is not simple. I mean, I started looking up things about episodic memory and semantic memory and short-term memory and long-term memory and flashbulb memory, and it just got really overwhelming really quickly. And then things started to get funny, because one scientist would say, hey, I did experiments on the memories of lab rats that suggest that human memories work differently than we thought. And he would start talking about the things that he'd found. And another group says, dude, you did that on rats. That's kind of a stretch to say that it works with rats, so that's the way it works with humans. So now we're going to give you a cold shoulder at scientific conferences because you're dumb. And other groups say, well, we're more open-minded than those other skeptics. We should look into this rat memory research, but who knows anything for sure anyway. One thing that scientists do seem to agree on when it comes to how our brains direct our attention and encode memories, the process is heavily influenced by emotions. Here's a quote from an article at psychologistworld.com, and you can see links to all these articles in the show notes as well. Research suggests that our brains are more likely to focus on stimuli of emotional significance. This was demonstrated in a 2007 study in which participants were shown a control set of emotionally neutral images with pictures such as those depicting various injuries, eliciting an emotional response. The study found that subjects' attention increased when emotional images were displayed to them, suggesting that our attention is instinctively drawn to emotive subjects. I'm going to stop right there. So, peer-reviewed researchers found that people were more interested in images that showed emotion. Do you think that might affect the way you build your thumbnails on YouTube? And let's just say that's probably the reason that thumbnails showing faces with over-the-top crazy emotions usually tend to work better than thumbnails that show our faces with emotionally neutral expressions. Damn it. I mean, what if we don't like having the slack-jawed, googly-eyed faces for thumbnails? But evidently, that's what our brains like, because if we look like goofballs in thumbnails, our brains say, oh, that's emotional. That looks interesting. I'll click on that. So back to science. Things get a little trickier here. So one of the factors for how our brains filter memories is emotion. And it's what helps our brains say, oh, this is a big deal. This is something worth paying attention to, and maybe even shipping over to our long-term memory department. And on the surface, as creators, we could say, okay, so in order to break through our audience's attention filters, to be part of that 0.0001% information that gets through to their brains, we need to create content with emotion-driven moments that people will remember. Got it. Here's where we add an extra layer, though. The Psychologist World article goes on to say this: a person's focus of attention will inevitably affect what they remember during an experience, but emotions appear to affect memory encoding more profoundly than simply drawing attention to a particular emotive subject over a neutral one. Get this. Your emotional state at the time of an event can help to determine whether or not your observations during it will be stored for recall later on. One study found that the subjects of an experiment were more able to associate with stories whose content matched their moods at the time of them being recounted to them. A happy person, for example, may associate more with characters who are positive and enthusiastic, while a sad person might identify with a character who's the subject of persecution. Gordon Bauer, who conducted the study, found that this mood congruence effect, that's the search term if you want to go digging, mood congruence, It's an association with stimuli which reflect our current mood. This influenced people's ability to remember information. The result of this effect is that you may be more able to recall having read a negative report in the newspaper if you were in a low mood, rather than happy at the time of reading it. Our brains pay attention to emotional content, but our brains also latch on to different emotions in the content based on how we're feeling when we watch it. For us creator types, that first part is something that we can control, but that second part, that's completely out of our hands. I was kind of scratching my head about that at first. Is that really how things work? But the more I thought about certain moments and memories of my own, the more I realized that this is probably true. Which takes us back to where this episode started in 2004, with me sitting in an edit suite in an office tower in the Wilshire district of Los Angeles, across the street from the La Brea tar pits, which, if you speak Spanish, is probably something that will make you giggle, because even though everyone in Los Angeles calls them the La Brea tar pits, if you know Spanish, you know that La Brea literally means the tar. So you're saying, we're going to go over to the tar pits. Go figure. So the gig that I was working on was a show called Supernanny. It was season 1 of Supernanny on ABC. It had started as a documentary-style show in the UK. It had gotten brought over to the United States to air on ABC. This is the first season of it, and it's all about a British nanny who comes over to the US and helps American parents regain control over their children who have run amok and are controlling the house. So I was editing the final scene to one of the episodes, and it had a crane shot in it. Now, here's why that was such a big deal. All my life, I grew up seeing movies with jib shots in them, with crane shots in them. Same thing, jib shot, crane shot, And I even got to the point where I would build little Lego models of little Lego guys riding around on this camera crane, because I thought it would be the coolest thing ever to do that in real life. And I said to myself, if I get to where I'm riding on the end of a camera crane for a legit reason, not just I'm on a studio taking a tour. If I'm riding a camera crane for an actual legit reason, that'll mean something. And I can point to that and say, I've arrived. Now, to this day, I've never flown on a camera crane, because right around the time that I got out to Los Angeles was right around the time that they started inventing remote control heads. And at that point, nobody was flying on the end of a camera crane anymore. But I did still get my moment, because editing this show Supernanny on season 1, Jo, the nanny, gets into the taxi and she literally drives off into the sunset. The taxi pulls away and the camera crane rises up and reveals the sunset over the horizon as the taxi drives off. Plus, I got to build the scene, I got to pick the music, and I picked out an orchestral cue that it just made you feel like you're coming to the end of this epic journey, and the journey was coming to a close, and the scene was just really, really working. It was really working well. And as I was building this, it was connecting these childhood and professional ambitions, and it was a dream fulfilled for me. And I sat there with tears of happiness rolling down my face. Now, in terms of the content, it was definitely emotional. I mean, that's the way it was built. And seeing Jo, the nanny, drive off into the sunset was absolutely crafted to tug at your heartstrings. But one of the bigger reasons that moment jumps out in my mind 20 years later was because it wasn't just the emotion of the content. It was also the place that I was in my life. It was the fulfillment of a dream. And the fact that I got to build out that moment and I got to help bring it to life and show that story to millions of viewers was a really, really big deal to me. And it was a real privilege to be part of that. As creators, We have to be aware that our audience's number one goal is to literally ignore almost everything that approaches their brain. It's the only way that the human brain can survive, never mind thrive. And when things do break through the brain's attention filter, our brains only hold on to certain moments while everything else fades away. So one way to build connections with our audience is to create content that contains memorable moments. Usually moments with elevated emotions, because that's how our brains are wired. Our brains are wired to respond to emotion. Now, this is easier said than done, because emotionally impactful content happens in the creating and also in the receiving. But it is possible, it happens all the time, and I want to help those kind of moments happen for you. So next time, I'm going to be diving into more examples of what that looks like and specific things you can do to maximize the chances of those connections happening between you and your audience. If you find these ideas valuable, and if you'd like to apply these ideas specifically to your own content, then you should join us in the Green Room. It is our private community here at Story Greenlight that's all about helping you level up your content, level up yourself, and get things done. You can get full access to the Green Room for a month for free. You can get started right now at the link in the description below. I'll see you there.